Okay, it's time to learn some history flashcards. Our colonial unit is gold, and it's gold because gold, God, and glory. These are the reasons for colonizing. So the 13 colonies, well, when did that get started? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. There's Columbus. And this is when Columbus discovers America, the New World. After that, of course, we have to make settlements. In 1607, Jamestown was no heaven. Why was Jamestown no heaven? Well, because it was hot, it was swampy, mosquitoes. Why? Because it was in Jamestown, Virginia, in the southern colonies, the first English settlement. Well, who was their leader? John Smith. John Smith is saved by Pocahontas, saves his life. We know that story from Walt Disney in the movie. But John Smith goes with Jamestown. He's the leader of Jamestown Colony. Says if you don't work, you don't eat. Then, in the Virginia House of Burgesses, this was from, in the Jamestown Colony, they started Virginia, and they vote. You see here we have the people voting, and that helps me remember the Virginia House of Burgesses. Well, that sounds like Virginia House of Burgers. Like at Burger King, you can have it your way. Well, when do you have it your way? When you vote. So here is where the people elected their own representatives. It was the first representative government in America. Then in 1620, the Pilgrims had plenty. Now we know the Pilgrims had plenty because we celebrate that Thanksgiving every year. The Pilgrims settled at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Well, the Pilgrims came in 1620 and had plenty, and they arrived on the Mayflower. The Mayflower was their boat, and they signed an agreement before they ever got off of the boat that said, see here they're agreeing, the Pilgrims agreed they would all follow the laws that they wrote. Well, this idea is that power comes from the people. So here they have self-government. They also gave us this idea of cultural borrowing. Because of Thanksgiving, they shared corn and guns. They worked together. Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to plant the corn. And it's where we borrow an idea that we take from another culture. Another group that came for religious reasons is the Puritans. They also came to Massachusetts, way up in the north, just like the Pilgrims. Pilgrims, Puritans in Massachusetts. But this group was very strict. Thomas Hooker was a leader of the Puritans, and yes, funny name. But Thomas Hooker's idea, he leaves Massachusetts and goes to Connecticut. He hooks up men to vote. That's how you can remember Thomas Hooker. What does that mean? Well, he started Connecticut, and he believed that all men should be able to vote, not just the church members. Remember, Puritans were very strict. So they kick him out, and he starts Connecticut. Here in Connecticut, he starts the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and again, goes with Thomas Hooker. And it says, all men should be able to vote, even non-church members, even if you don't go to church. Well, you did have to be a man, and you did have to be white. Well, this goes with two people that got kicked out also of Massachusetts. Anne Hutchinson. This is the only girl that we have on our colony notes, and here she heresy, not heresy, but heresy, but that helps us to remember that Anne Hutchinson, the woman, it goes with her, because she was speaking up about women's rights to speak in the Puritan church. And she was accused of false teaching, heresy. So she got kicked out of Massachusetts. Another one that got kicked out, remember these Puritans were so strict, was Roger Williams. He got kicked out and went to Rhode Island. See the R's? Roger Williams, Rhode Island. So he goes and starts Rhode Island because he was exiled from Massachusetts as well. So Anne Hutchinson, Roger Williams, and Thomas Hooker, all Puritans that leave Massachusetts and start other colonies. Now let's look at William Penn. William Penn was not a Puritan, he was a Quaker. Now see, he even looks like a Quaker, like the Quaker Oats guy. Well, that's where that comes from. And why Quaker Oats? Well, because William Penn is a Quaker, and he starts Pennsylvania. Now, what's the deal with Quakers? Who are they? Well, they believe in paying Indians for their land. They believed, of course, freedom of religion and in self-government. But they needed to get away from England because people made fun of them and called them Quakers. They don't really like to be called Quakers, but that's because when they would get together in their church services, they don't really have a leader. They believe all people are equal. And they would, that was just really a strange idea. Now, let's look at primary and secondary sources. A primary source and a secondary source. Let's look at these two things. A primary source is one person, because that one person, primero in Spanish, that one person is there. First-hand information, eyewitness account. They were there, they saw it, or maybe it's a source, a document, a diary, any kind of court records. A secondary source is where you hear it from other people. It takes two people, so that's secondary, okay? Hearing it from others. That's where you are not an eyewitness and you're getting secondhand information. Which one would be more reliable? Primary or secondary? Well, of course, you're going to go with primary. Now let's look at a couple others. The triangular trade, Middle Passage, and mercantilism. These all have to do with shipping and trading, and mercantilism is one of the reasons that the colonies get started. Remember, gold, glory. So mercantilism, look at that. In Spanish, mercado, and in English, merchant. They all come from this word. It means to buy or sell. Because in a merchant is a market, mercado, and that's where you buy or sell. Now this is where a country controls the imports, where you buy, and the exports, where you sell your goods. The colonies of North America existed for the good of England. But the colonies did not just sell to England, which was illegal, mercantilism, but they instead would also sell to other areas. They would buy slaves in Africa. They would then trade for rum in Cuba and the West Indies, and then sell those for guns. And they would get, so this was a triangular trade that was happening. You have three areas, and that's the shipping routes between the colonies, the Africa, and the West Indies Islands, or around where Cuba is today. Now, on that trade route, that middle passage from Africa over to Cuba, this was a long, long trip. And this trip was where the ships would carry the slaves. Look at how they were just crammed in to those. Those are representations of slaves just crammed in there, naked, barely fed them, no bathrooms. You would get sick. It was very horrible. This was a ship's voyage that imported slaves from Africa, and of course, many, many died. Now there is our 3 sections of colonies. We've studied these: the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies. The New England colonies were in the north. That's where it was cold, of course, because it's furthest from the equator. New England. Why did they call it New England? Well, because the land was a lot like that in England. It was a cold climate, rocky soil, so all they could do was fish and shipping and whaling. It had a short growing season. In the middle colonies, this is where it was warmer, it had much better soil, and they could actually have bread and grains and iron. Now, this helps me remember my favorite part of the bread is in the middle. I don't like the crust. Then this is also known as the breadbasket colonies. They raised animals, grain, and iron. Then you have your southern colonies. This is in the south. The south, of course, is very hot, and that's where many, many of the slaves would be put to work in the fields. You can see there on the plantations with a rich planter farmer and the slaves out working the fields. The tobacco, the cotton, had fertile soil, longer growing season, and life revolved around plantations or large farms. Our last set of cards are these over here. We have the Enlightenment, the First Great Awakening. These two people always get mixed up, but they're really pretty easy if you think about them like this. People lots of times go to sleep at church, so this is where they need to awaken. The First Great Awakening. Awakening because this is the first time in the 1700s when people began to see that people were equal in God's eyes. People never thought that they were equal. They always thought the rich were more important to God, that the kings were more important to God. But here, they began to see a religious toleration. This mainly happened in the middle colonies. Then we have the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment doesn't have to do with church at all. It has to do with light. Now, not did they discover the light bulb. They didn't invent the light bulb. Of course, they didn't have electricity in light bulbs yet. But we do think of light bulbs when we have an idea, right? That's sort of a symbol that you see in cartoons. So here is where people are actually reading. They're reading and learning, and they're using this knowledge to come up with ideas. The Enlightenment. This is a thinking period, intellectual movement, where people began to think and use their reasoning skills and making inventions. So this is when science really becomes big, like Sir Isaac Newton and stuff like that. All right, then we got these last two. Now these are some big documents. This one is really old. In 1215, Magna Carta. Magna means big, Carta means letter. And here you have the king. Well, it's going to be a big deal when the king has to share his power. King John was forced to share power. This shows no one is above the law, not even the king. And this is our right to trial by jury, not just to be in front of a judge, but to let other people also be our judge. Then this is the last one, the Albany Plan of Union. This happens much later in 1754, where Benjamin Franklin makes the first political cartoon in the colonies, and he says, "Join or die." Here we see the snake and it's cut into pieces, and each of the pieces are represented by an initial. Those are the colonies. The first proposal to unite the American colonies was made by Ben Franklin. He says this when he makes this cartoon, when the French and Indians attack the British and the American colonists, who of course are British, and they begin to fight to see who's going to have the greater power. This is during the French and Indian War in 1754.